All right, strap yourselves in, because today's deep dive is going to be a wild one. We're going to be looking at some pretty out there claims about French President Emmanuel Macron and his wife, Brigitte.
Oh, this should be interesting.
Yeah, and get this. Our only source today.
Hmm.
It's just one video from American conservative commentator Candace Owens, where she's sort of previewing this big series she's doing.
So just to be clear, we're not endorsing and debunking anything she's saying, right?
Exactly. We just want to unpack what Owens is putting out there and see what we find.
Yeah, and hopefully help our listeners think critically about how to approach information like this, too. It's super important these days.
Absolutely. So this is where it gets crazy. Owens' central claim, she's alleging that Brigitte Macron was assigned male at birth.
Whoa.
Yeah. And she goes on to say that the Macrons are hiding this fact from the public. Like, she even says she'd bet her whole career on it.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
For sure.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, why would someone make such a bold claim?
Right. What's the motivation behind it? Is it a genuine belief? A way to get attention? Something else entirely?
Great questions to be asking ourselves whenever we come across these kind of extraordinary claims.
Totally.
And she doesn't stop there. Owens also claims there's this whole web of scandals surrounding the Macrons.
What kind of scandals?
Get this, she throws around words like pedophilia and the occult.
Okay, now hold on a sec. Before we go any further, I think it's super important to understand what those terms actually mean. Pedophilia is a really serious accusation. It refers to sexual attraction to prepubescent children, a serious criminal offense.
Right.
And then occult is a much broader term. It kind of covers practices and beliefs outside of mainstream religion or science. So Owens using this language definitely sets a pretty dramatic tone from the start.
Yeah, it really does. And to add fuel to the fire, Owens claims she actually got a legal threat from the Macrons' lawyers because of all these allegations. But instead of backing down, she actually sees this as proof they're trying to silence her and hide something.
Well, legally speaking, a threat doesn't automatically equal guilt. Defamation law, and that's what would apply here, it's incredibly complex.
Okay.
Often it boils down to proving that there was malicious intent and that the statements were demonstrably false. So it's not a simple case of, they tried to shut me up, so I must be right.
No, not as simple as that, no.
Right.
Okay, this next part is interesting. Owens says she sent Brigitte Macron 21 straightforward yes or no questions about her identity.
Interesting tactic.
But got no response back, which she presents as further evidence that something's fishy.
Well, I mean, logically, unanswered questions don't actually prove a claim is true, right?
Yeah, I guess not.
But they can certainly raise suspicion, especially in the public eye. It plays on that idea that if you have nothing to hide, you would just quickly deny it.
Right, like that old saying, no smoke without fire.
Exactly. But it is worth remembering that people choose not to engage for all sorts of reasons. Legal advice, maybe. Or simply not wanting to dignify a baseless accusation with a response.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, buckle up, because this is where things get even more convoluted. Owens brings up these reports that former President Trump supposedly had some sort of compromising information about Macron's sex life,
Oh, boy.
which, as she puts it, caused a huge transatlantic freakout.
So this is a prime example of how a single source can lead down a rabbit hole of speculation. We have Owens referencing news reports, but we don't actually know the details of those reports.
Right?
Their sources, their credibility, it becomes like a game of telephone. Information gets distorted along the way.
So we're missing crucial pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah. And without those pieces, it's impossible to form a clear picture or draw any real conclusions like, what was this compromising information anyway? Did it even exist? And why would it cause such a stir? It's all very intriguing, but gotta recognize we're in the realm of conjecture here.
All right. And just when you thought it couldn't get any wilder, Owens goes on to interpret the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics as satanic. Yeah. Specifically, she points to a scene that kind of resembled Da Vinci's Last Supper, but performed by LGBTQ+ individuals.
I see. Well, this is a great example of how symbolism can be a double-edged sword. Different people can read vastly different meanings into the same imagery.
Especially when it comes to stuff like religion or historical events.
Absolutely. Without understanding the creator's intent, the cultural context, you risk projecting your own assumptions and biases, especially when you're dealing with topics as sensitive as religion and sexuality.
Okay, so this next part focuses on something a little less out there. Owens shifts gears to the Macrons' 24-year age gap, calling their relationship, quote, unpalatable. And she really emphasizes that Brigitte was Emmanuel's teacher when he was just 14 years old.
Yeah, this raises some interesting points about societal perceptions of age gaps in relationships, especially when there's a significant power dynamic, like in a student-teacher scenario. Even if it's legally permissible, a lot of people find those kinds of relationships ethically questionable.
Right, regardless of who the individuals involved are.
Exactly. Laws often lag behind evolving social norms, and what's considered acceptable can vary widely across cultures and generations.
So legality and social acceptance don't always line up.
Definitely not. It's important to acknowledge that people might have valid concerns about certain relationships, even if no laws are broken.
Okay, now we're back to the strange stuff. Owens claims Brigitte actually supported a design for the Notre Dame Cathedral spire that featured, and I quote, an erect phallus with golden balls.
Whoa, okay. But wasn't that design never actually implemented?
You're right, it wasn't, but Owens cites a former culture minister as backing her up on this.
It's crucial to remember that attributing specific intentions to a design without concrete evidence, well, that's venturing into speculation. Artistic interpretations can be very subjective.
So what one person sees as a phallic symbol, another might interpret totally differently.
Exactly. We need to consider the artist's intentions, the historical context, the overall message the work's trying to convey. Without that, it's easy to fall into the trap of seeing what we want to see, or what fits a pre-existing narrative.
Context is everything.
It really is.
Okay, and this is where Owens really starts connecting the dots, and I gotta say, it gets pretty wild. She brings up this artist, Claude Levesque, whose work Brigitte supposedly favored.
Okay.
But then she points out that he was later convicted of the rape of minors. So she's basically saying, see, I told you.
Ah, yes. This is a classic example of what we call implied guilt, right? Connecting the dots without evidence. Even if Brigitte admired Levesque's work, it doesn't automatically mean she condoned or was even aware of his criminal behavior.
It's like saying just because you like a painter's work doesn't mean you endorse everything they've done in their life.
Exactly. We have to be so cautious about making those leaps in logic, especially when we're dealing with sensitive issues like this.
All right. Next, Owens turns her attention to Macron's official presidential portrait. But she specifically zeroes in on the book that's featured in it.
Okay.
It's by André Gide, who we know was openly a pederast.
Oh, yeah.
And Owens implies that this choice of book is Macron deliberately signaling his approval of pedophilia.
It seems like we're back to interpreting symbolism without context. André Gide was a complex figure, a Nobel Prize-winning author whose work is still studied and debated today. So, to reduce his entire legacy to this one aspect and then connect it to Macron's intentions solely because of a book and a portrait, that requires a pretty significant leap in logic.
It's like focusing on one pixel of a picture and claiming it represents the whole image.
Exactly. Got to look at the bigger picture, consider the historical context, and avoid jumping to conclusions based on isolated details.
Okay, up next. Owens talks about Olivier Duhamel. He was a powerful French politician and an early supporter of Macron's, but later Duhamel admitted to sexually abusing his stepson. So Owens uses this to paint Macron and his whole circle as being, at the very least, tolerant of such behavior.
So we're back to the issue of implied guilt again. While it's fair to scrutinize a politician's connections, implying complicity in criminal acts without evidence is a dangerous road to go down. Got to separate someone's actions from those of their associates unless there's concrete proof of direct involvement.
So just because someone knows or supports a person who commits a crime, that doesn't make them guilty by association.
Absolutely. We got to be wary of drawing those conclusions without sufficient evidence. Guilt by association can be used to smear someone's reputation, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the truth.
Wow, this is already a lot to unpack, and we're just getting started.
Right.
Owens then suggests that journalists who've tried to look into these claims have been silenced or met with, let's say, unfortunate ends. She points to the death of Isabella Ferrer, a journalist who was found dead in a river.
Oh, wow.
And then the legal and financial troubles of other journalists like Natasha Ray and Xavier Boussard. Owens presents herself as the only one brave enough to speak truth to power.
Well, look, it is crucial to investigate any claims of media suppression and protect journalists who are doing important work. However, we also need to remember that journalists, just like anyone else, face personal and professional challenges that might be totally unrelated to their reporting.
So attributing every setback to a grand conspiracy, that can be really misleading.
Absolutely.
And it can distract from legitimate concerns about press freedom.
Right. We need to be careful about connecting every dot without sufficient evidence.
Okay. Whew.
Yeah.
So, after all that, Owens is building a narrative where the Macrons are at the center of this web of darkness and deceit. But her evidence really relies heavily on innuendo, implied guilt, interpretations of symbolism that lack concrete proof. What are your thoughts so far?
It's certainly provocative and attention-grabbing. Owens definitely raises some interesting questions, but ultimately she hasn't presented the kind of concrete evidence needed to back up her claims. This is where critical thinking comes in, right?
Yeah.
It's our responsibility as listeners to evaluate the information that's being presented, consider different perspectives, and seek out additional sources.
Great point. Just so you know, there's one more piece to this puzzle that Owens reveals in her video. She claims to have a source, a French journalist named Xavier Boussard, who's been digging into this for years.
Oh, really?
And she says he's uncovered some truly shocking information.
Now this is where things get really interesting.
Right. Owens promises that Boussard will be featured in her upcoming series, and he'll reveal all this bombshell evidence about Brigitte Macron's past.
So we'll have to wait and see what this evidence is and whether it stands up to scrutiny.
We will. And we'll dive into that and more in part 2 of this deep dive, so don't go anywhere. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into Candace Owens and her claims about the Macrons. Just a reminder, we're still only looking at one side of the story here, Owens' perspective.
Yeah, it's like we're only hearing half the conversation. You know, getting her take but missing the other side of the story. Gotta keep that in mind.
Absolutely. So, last we left off, Owens was really digging into these alleged scandals surrounding the Macrons, focusing on Brigitte's supposed fascination with what she calls freaky art.
Right, and she uses specific examples, right? Like that time Brigitte chose a carpet designed by Claude Levesque for the Élysée Palace.
Oh, yeah, and then she points out that Levesque was later convicted of the rape of minors. It's like she's saying, see, I told you, Brigitte's got a thing for this kind of stuff. But isn't that line of thinking pretty flawed?
It is. It's that implied guilt thing again. Admiring someone's art doesn't mean you agree with or even know about their criminal behavior.
It's like saying everyone who loves Michael Jackson's music must also condone all the accusations against him. Just not a logical jump to make.
Exactly. We can appreciate art without endorsing the artist's actions or beliefs. Super important to remember that.
Okay, moving on. So Owens then turned her attention back to Macron's presidential portrait. Specifically, that book that's featured in it.
By André Gide, right, the one who is openly a pederast.
That's the one. And she's claiming Macron is intentionally sending a message of approval by having that book there.
Again, this feels like reading way too much into a single detail. Gide was complicated, a Nobel Prize winner. His work is still studied today. Reducing his legacy to just that one aspect and then connecting it to Macron's intentions based on a book and a portrait, that's a huge stretch.
It's like she's picking and choosing elements that fit a narrative.
It's possible. When we're given information, remember, it's often framed to support a certain point of view. Got to step back and see the whole picture, not just those select pieces.
Okay, makes sense. Next, Owens talks about Olivier Duhamel, a French politician who was a big supporter of Macron.
Yeah, I remember him. Later admitted to abusing his stepson.
Right, and Owens used this to paint Macron and his whole circle as tolerant of that kind of behavior.
Ah, there's that implied guilt dynamic again.
Yeah.
Look, it's fair to question a politician's connections, but implying complicity in criminal acts without any real proof, that's irresponsible.
It's like saying, if your friend gets caught speeding, you must be a reckless driver too. Doesn't really make sense, does it?
Not at all. We've got to be careful about making those assumptions about people. Judge individuals on their own actions, not the actions of others.
Okay, next up. Owens suggests that journalists who've tried to investigate these claims have been, let's say, silenced. She brings up the death of Isabella Ferrer.
The journalist who was found dead in a river.
Yeah. And then the legal and financial trouble other journalists like Natasha Ray and Xavier Boussard have faced. Owens paints herself as this brave truth teller, the only one willing to speak up.
Well, we definitely need to look into any claims of media suppression. Protecting journalists doing important work is crucial, but journalists, like everyone else, face personal and professional challenges, things that might not have anything to do with their reporting.
So not every bad thing that happens is a conspiracy to hide the truth.
Exactly. We need that critical thinking here, too. Investigating claims, sure, but not assuming every negative event is a deliberate attempt to silence dissent.
Finding that balance.
Right.
Being aware of potential threats to press freedom, but not oversimplifying things and blaming everything on one cause.
It's about nuance, considering different viewpoints, realizing that things aren't always so black and white.
Right. Okay, as we wrap up this part of our deep dives, Owens has given us a lot to think about. Her claims are definitely eye-catching, provocative even. but so much of it is unsubstantiated.
A good example of how a single source can tell a really compelling story. But it's on us as critical thinkers to dig deeper, look at the evidence, and consider other viewpoints before making up our minds.
And speaking of digging deeper, Owens claims she has this key source, a French journalist named Xavier Boussard.
Oh, yeah, the one she said has been investigating all this for years.
Yeah, it's him. She says he's uncovered some seriously shocking information.
This is the hook, right? The promise of big reveals to come gets people wanting more, eager to see how it all plays out.
Exactly. Owen says Boussard is going to be in her upcoming series, and he'll spill the beans on Brigitte Macron's past. She even says he's faced a ton of pressure and intimidation because of what he knows. Audits, harassment, even a search of his mother's house.
If that's all true, those are some serious allegations. But we got to remember this is all filtered through Owen's lens. We haven't heard from Boussard directly, can't take anything at face value just yet.
So, wait and see for now. Hear what Boussard has to say himself and judge his claims independently before deciding if they hold any weight.
Exactly. Healthy skepticism. Being aware of potential bias. Recognizing that there's often more to the story than what we initially see.
Okay, that's all the time we have for part 2 of this deep dive. But we'll be back for part 3, where we'll look at what Owens' allegations could mean and how they fit into the current political landscape.
Hopefully along the way, we'll all get a little better at navigating this crazy world of information.
Stay tuned. All right, welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into Candace Owens' claims about the Macrons. We've gone through a lot, from Brigitte's supposed hidden past to this whole idea of a network of powerful people involved in, well, some pretty dark stuff.
Yeah, a lot to process, for sure. And I think as we wrap up, it's important to step back and look at the bigger picture. We've explored Owens's viewpoint, but gotta remember, it's just one side of a complex story.
Like we've been working on this puzzle, but only have a few pieces, right?
Exactly. And Owens says she has the missing pieces, the ones that'll complete the picture, but we haven't seen them yet. So we're kind of left with all these questions and this feeling of, is there something more here or not?
Yeah, it is kind of like that. So let's do a quick recap. Owens alleges that Brigitte Macron was assigned male at birth, and the Macrons, along with the media, are covering it up. Unanswered questions, the legal threat, journalists being silenced. She points to all of that as evidence.
It doesn't kind of cloak and dagger, right?
Yeah, but none of that alone actually proves anything, does it?
Not really. Unanswered questions can make people suspicious, but they don't confirm anything. Legal threats could just be a way to intimidate someone and don't mean someone's guilty. And while silencing journalists is a big deal that definitely needs to be investigated, it's not proof of anything specific in this case.
It's like saying, well, my neighbor always keeps their curtains closed, so they must be counterfeiting money in their basement. I mean, there could be lots of reasons for closed curtains that have nothing to do with illegal stuff.
Exactly. Avoid those leaps in logic. Look for solid evidence before jumping to conclusions. It's okay to be curious, to investigate, but don't just go for the most dramatic explanation without proof.
Right. Okay, so Owens also spends a lot of time trying to tie the Macrons to certain people and events that she says show their involvement in, or at least tolerance of, pedophilia and the occult. She brings up the artist Claude Levesque, the author André Gide, the politician Olivier Duhamel, even the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics.
This is where we have to be super careful about that guilt by association thing and not misinterpreting symbolism. Just because someone likes an artist or author or goes to an event doesn't mean they agree with everything that person has done or stands for.
It's like saying, well, I saw you having lunch with that guy who got caught shoplifting, so you must be a thief too. Doesn't really add up, right?
Not at all. People have complicated relationships. We can't judge someone just based on who they know.
Owens also really portrays herself as this lone warrior fighting against, the big bad guys. Like she's the only one brave enough to speak the truth. That's a pretty common theme in conspiracy theories, isn't it?
It is. It kind of taps into this human desire for truth and justice, that suspicion of those in power. But it's important to be aware of that tactic and not let it stop us from thinking critically and looking for real evidence. Just because someone says they're telling the truth doesn't make it so.
So where does all this leave us? Owens has presented this pretty shocking theory, but a lot of it's not really supported by evidence. She says there are more revelations to come, especially from her main source, that French journalist, Xavier Boussard.
That's the cliffhanger. If this Boussard guy can actually back up Owens' claims with solid proof, then yeah, this could be a really big deal. But if what he says isn't convincing, or gets debunked easily, well, then our whole story falls apart.
It's like waiting for that DNA test to tell you if someone's actually related to you or not. We have the theory, but we need that final piece of evidence to know for sure.
Exactly. Got to be patient, wait for the evidence, don't make up your mind until you have all the facts.
So in the end, it's up to each person to decide what they believe. But I think the main takeaway here is to think critically, be media literate, and look at things from different angles. Don't just take what you hear at face value, especially with complicated topics like this one.
Well said. And this is a story that'll probably keep developing. So as it does, we got to be prepared to analyze the information, look at the evidence, and really think about what we're being told.
And that's what makes for a good deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this one. We'll be back soon with another topic to explore. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay informed.